On Thanksgiving weekend 1981, a 60-foot yacht called the Splendor left the Californian coastline and headed towards the island of Catalina. Little did its occupants know that over 40 years later, the world would still be discussing what happened on that fateful voyage. As today I bring you one curious true story and 3 related very brilliant books. In the early hours of a November morning in 1981, a yacht owned by the actor Robert Wagner and his wife Natalie Wood sent out a distress signal. It said, "This is the Splendor, help needed." Some 6 hours later, the body of Natalie Wood, who at that time was one of the greatest and most well-known actors in Hollywood, was found floating face down in the Pacific Ocean. But what happened to her, and why did witnesses change their stories some 20 years later? And what persuaded Natalie, whose fear of water was absolutely legendary, to leave that yacht and try and escape in a dinghy? But before we get into that, if you're a fan of curious true stories and you love a good book recommendation, then you are in the right place, because that's all we do, and I upload every single Sunday. So if you enjoy this video, please click on the like button, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to make sure you don't miss any future episodes. And now let's get back to Natalie Wood.
I've always been terrified, still am, of water, dark water, seawater.
The untimely death of 43-year-old actor Natalie Wood in November 1981 stunned not only Hollywood, but the rest of the world, and it wasn't long before many different rumours started to circulate. Not far from Natalie's body, the Splendor's 13-foot inflatable dinghy was found washed up against some rocks. Its ignition was off, its gear stick was in neutral, and its oars were locked. People wanted to know what had driven Natalie, whose fear of dark water was very well documented, to leave the Splendor on a cold, dark, starless night and try to escape on an inflatable dinghy, and what caused her to be found floating face down in the Pacific Ocean. As police started their investigation, the public's questions and theories multiplied, not least of all because the relationship between Natalie and her husband Robert Wagner got a lot of attention, and not always for the right reasons. Natalie Wood was born Natalie Zakharenko in San Francisco to parents of Russian descent who themselves had fled Russia as children with their families. When Natalie was a toddler, they moved to Santa Rosa. It was there that she was spotted by talent scouts, and after the studio changed her name to Wood to an appeal to an American audience, can you imagine doing that now? Her rise to fame as a child actor began. Robert Wagner was also the child of an immigrant. In his case, his mother was Norwegian, but he grew up in the very rich and sought-after area of Bel Air, in a house overlooking the very prestigious Bel Air Country Club. And as a young boy, he would golf caddy to such stars as Clark Gable and Fred Astaire. Natalie and Robert met when Natalie was 18 and Robert was 26. Natalie was a veteran of some 25 movies by that point, and she had just made the rare transition from child to adult star. Robert, however, was still an aspiring star at 20th Century Fox and struggling to find suitable roles. Perhaps because of this inequality, perhaps because they were so young, their marriage failed and they divorced in 1962, with rumours of infidelity on both sides. Natalie and Robert both went on to marry and divorce a second time, but 10 years after their first marriage ended, they got together again, stepping out publicly for the first time at the Academy Awards and causing pandemonium. They married each other again in 1972 on board a borrowed yacht, which then sailed to Catalina, where they enjoyed their second honeymoon. Catalina featured very heavily during their second marriage. Despite Natalie's fear of dark water, they both loved boats, and in 1975 they bought a yacht together. It was originally called the Challenger, and they renamed it Splendor after a line in a Wordsworth poem, even though it is supposed to be bad luck to change the name of a boat. Natalie and Robert spent many weekends sailing around Catalina, and they hired a young man who had helped to bring the Splendor from Florida to California as their captain. His name was Dennis Deverne. Dennis Deverne had been around boats since he was 6 years old and was a very experienced sailor, and it was Dennis who was also on board the night of that fateful voyage in 1981, as was actor Christopher Walken, who was filming with Natalie at the time. Now, there were rumours circulating which were confirmed by Natalie's own sister that Natalie was quite infatuated with Christopher Walken, and Robert Wagner seemed to be aware of this too. Despite the seemingly fairy tale story of their second marriage, their relationship was peppered with jealousy and arguments, and Captain Dennis Deverne, in subsequent interviews, alluded to Natalie's heavy drinking and possible abuse of prescription medication to get her through difficult days. With this strange dynamic, all four of them boarded the Splendor at around noon on Friday the 27th of November 1981. Now, Dennis Deverne, the captain, recalls that Natalie was giving Christopher Walken a lot of attention, and he got the impression that her husband was not impressed. There was also a lot of drinking going on and a lot of smoking of joints. And Dennis Deverne said, the boat just starts getting smaller. You can't look for a whole lot of escape. It must have been a very claustrophobic atmosphere for all of them, but especially perhaps for Robert Wagner, watching his wife flirting with this much younger man. They docked about a quarter of a mile south of Avalon, which is the main city on the island of Catalina. Catalina itself is about 22 miles off the coast of California. Now, on the first night, the sea was grumpy, according to the captain, and an argument developed between Natalie and her husband Robert about whether to move the boat into calmer waters. Robert did not want to move it. Natalie wanted the boat shifted should it was too rough. The row became more and more heated, and eventually Natalie, accompanied by the captain Dennis Deverne, who also acted as a kind of bodyguard, went ashore on the inflatable dinghy to Catalina Island rather than spend the night on the Splendor because she said it was far too rough. But the following morning, they returned, having stayed in a hotel, and everything was smoothed over. Now it's the second day that things started to get a little bit awkward. Natalie and Christopher drank the clock around, according to the captain. Whilst the captain and Robert stayed sober, by the time the four of them went ashore in the evening to go to dinner, Natalie and Christopher were quite inebriated, and Robert was getting very, very irritated with his wife's behaviour and all this flirting that was going on. And this was corroborated by the restaurant staff, who reported many arguments between the two of them over the course of the evening, including glass and crockery being smashed at the table, and the four of them being very unhappy about everything and complaining to staff about everything from the size of the table to the lighting to the freshness of the fish they were being served. So they sound like really excellent customers, a joy to deal with, I would imagine. Later at the press conference, it was said that the non-violent argument, that is in inverted commas, that occurred on the yacht after their return to the Splendor after this awful meal, and this electrified the press, that there was a non-violent argument going on, and it fueled speculation of what actually happened. Now, Robert Wagner said when he and Christopher Walken got back to the Splendor that night, they got into a bit of a political discussion, which on top of a lot of alcohol is never a very good idea. And this discussion became very loud, although non-violent, he said. And he said Natalie seemed quite bored by the whole thing and went to bed. Who can blame her, really? Wagner said that about an hour later, he went to kiss his wife goodnight and found that she was missing. And speculating on how she came to be in the water and how she came to be drowned, he said to the police that the dinghy that was attached to the yacht, the one that they used to go backwards and forwards to Catalina, kept banging on the side of the yacht, and it annoyed Natalie because it kept her awake. And she possibly went out there to try and tighten the ropes to stop it banging, and because it was very slippy and raining and she was only wearing a nightwear, she must have kind of tripped on the deck, slipped and fallen overboard. Now, Christopher Walken was immediately excluded from the inquiry and was not thought to have anything to do whatsoever with the incidents on or off board. He said that Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner got into an argument about how much time Natalie was spending away from home and away from her children. Now Walken said he really did not want to get involved in this kind of drunken discussion, so he went on deck for a few minutes, and when he came back into the room, everything was fine, and Natalie said goodnight to them both and went to bed. The next thing he says he remembers is the captain coming into his room saying that Natalie was missing. Now the captain, Dennis Deverne, his statement to the police about what happened when they got back from the restaurant and went to the Splendor and came on board again, it was pretty much the same as Christopher Walken and Robert Wagner's statements. It kind of corroborated it. However, 20 years later, he told a very different story. He said that Natalie and Christopher were still fighting when they got back to the boat. They'd been fighting throughout the whole course of this meal, getting angry with each other. A glass was smashed. They were very kind of prickly and arguing. And when they got back to the boat, this carried on. Now, Robert was witnessing all evening his wife flirting with Christopher Walken, and he got to the end of his tether, and the captain said he smashed a bottle of wine on the table and accused Christopher of trying to seduce his wife. Christopher Walken left the room, walked away from the argument. Natalie went to her bedroom. Robert followed Natalie to the bedroom, according to Dennis Deverne. Now Dennis at this point was on the bridge, and he was right over the Wagner's bedroom, and he could hear everything. And he said he had never heard an argument so vicious and spiteful and loud and violent as the argument that these two were having underneath where he was standing. He said things were being thrown around, there was a lot of accusations, and then it carried out onto the deck because the argument came out of the room. One of them must have walked out of the room, the other followed, and they carried on arguing in the open air on the deck. The Captain Deverne said that he then heard the dinghy being untied. He could hear the ropes moving. And then it went silent, he said. And a few minutes later, Wagner appeared next to him, very tousled and kind of agitated and sweating. And he carried on drinking, didn't say anything about what had happened. And about 11 o'clock, Deverne, the captain, said Wagner told him he was going to go and speak to his wife. He was going to go and kind of try and make it up. And that's when he came back into the room and said that she was missing. Dennis Deverne searched the entire yacht for Natalie Wood. He looked everywhere. He even looked in his own quarters because she had been known to kind of seek sanctuary in there when she was fed up or her husband was arguing with her, but she wasn't in there either. He also went to Christopher Walken's quarters, which is when he woke him up, and she wasn't in there either. And then he realised that the dinghy was missing. He said to Wagner he was going to turn on the ship's floodlights to search for her, but Wagner told him not to. Deverne also wanted to sail around and look for Wood in the immediate vicinity, but again, Robert Wagner said not to, and he said, because we don't want to alert all of these people. This is according to Dennis Deverne. Now, back in 1981, Dennis Deverne told the police none of this, and the case was recorded very quickly, within 2 weeks, as an accidental drowning. It was confirmed by the autopsy, which also reported superficial bruises and abrasions and a blood alcohol level just above the drink-drive limit. And there were also traces of anti-sickness, kind of seasickness pills in her system, which would have exacerbated the effects of the alcohol. The Los Angeles chief medical examiner suggested that Natalie Wood had fallen in the ocean while she was attempting to either board the dinghy or release it from its ropes to stop it banging against the side of the yacht, and she was doing it whilst intoxicated. There were fingernail marks on the side of the dinghy which suggested she'd fallen overboard and then was trying to claw her way back into the dinghy. But because she was weighed down by all of these night clothes that she was wearing, she found it impossible, and she clung to the side of the drifting dinghy until she was either overcome by cold and exhaustion and had subsequently drowned. That was the chief medical officer's opinion on the whole thing, which sounds pretty feasible, doesn't it? Except, as one journalist pointed out, the public are not interested in how intoxicated Natalie Wood was, but why someone with a known phobia, a severe phobia of dark water, felt compelled to leave the yacht that night. So with these later statements, we seem to have quite conflicting reports on exactly what happened to Natalie the night she died. But before we get into the theories about what occurred on the Splendor on that evening of 1981, let's look at three very brilliant books, all focusing on unusual vessels and strange voyages. Now, the first book, you're going to have to imagine that I'm holding it for you because I only have it in digital format. And I could hold up my laptop, but that would be quite boring, wouldn't it? It's called Into the Wreck, and it's by Susanna Dickey. And I'm going to put up a picture of the cover while I'm speaking about it. This is a story set in a coastal town in Ireland about 5 members of the same family, all mourning the death of a loving but distant father. As the funeral approaches and the family gathers together, they are all individually drawn to the hull of a ship which is beached on the sand, providing a beautiful and powerful symbol of grief and loss. And it's how they each approach that wreck and explore it that affects their approach and reaction to their different and alternative losses. Now, Susanna Dickey is a poet by trade, and it really shows in this novel because there is not one spare word in this book. Every word earns its place, and there's a kind of musicality and poetry to her writing. I actually reviewed this for The Guardian, and if you want to have a read more about this story and how much I loved it, because I really did love it, then I will leave a link in the description box to The Guardian review. Next up, we have a very different book. It is The Last Passenger by Will Dean. This is a thriller. It's incredibly twisty and turny. And the premise is about a woman who is going on a cruise with her boyfriend, Southampton to New York City, a trip of a lifetime. She is so excited, except she wakes up on the first night on board this giant ship to find that her boyfriend is not in bed at the side of her where she expects him to be. Nor is he on the balcony, nor is he anywhere else on board because she looks everywhere. And more than just her boyfriend disappearing, she wakes to discover this giant ship has no staff, no captain, and no other passengers. She is the only person on board. Where did they all go? There were hundreds of them the day before. Now, when I heard that premise, I knew I needed to read this book very urgently. It's such a clever story. It's kind of a locked room, but with water. And Will Dean is brilliant at writing claustrophobic stories. I've spoken about this before on Instagram. He writes utterly brilliantly about people who are trapped. And this woman is well and truly trapped on this ship with no one else on board. And she's got to kind of learn how to survive and try and figure out what has happened. Can't recommend this enough. I absolutely devoured it. I think I read it in one sitting because it is just so gripping. So if you love a twisty turny tale, then this is your jam and I highly recommend it. And finally, we have one of my favourite books. This is Quint by Robert Lautner. This is a perfect blend of fact, fiction and movies because it's a tale of the sea-grizzled captain from Jaws. You remember him, of course you remember him. But before he met Chief Brody and needed a bigger boat. Now, you may remember from either the book or the film that Quint was on board the USS Indianapolis. And this novel is the story of what happened to him on that ship and how it shaped his life forever. The USS Indianapolis was, of course, a real ship, which was responsible for delivering crucial components of the atomic bomb during World War II and was struck and sunk by Japanese torpedoes. Now, there were 1,200 men on board. 900 of them survived those torpedo strikes. However, only 316 survived the entire thing. As the mission was so top secret, the Navy only realised that the ship was missing some 4 days later, during which time nearly 600 men died needlessly from dehydration, saltwater poisoning and shark attacks. It really is an absolute tragedy, and this book discusses it from the personal level of Quint, who was an incredible character in both Peter Benchley's book and in, of course, the film. And Robert Lautner gets his voice absolutely bang on. It's as though he is sitting here talking to you. And this is written so brilliantly and with such a distinctive voice. It feels like a great American novel. It is kind of a great English novel, but it feels like, you know, one of the classic American novels because it is written so brilliantly. and the voice is so real and so credible. If you enjoyed Jaws, or even if you've never watched Jaws, or you have no interest in sharks, grizzly sea captains or bigger boats, this book is just beautiful, and it tells a really, really important story, which is a crucial part of the history of World War II. And now back to that fateful night in 1981 to see if we can unravel a bit of what happened to Natalie Wood and which of these stories is the closest to the truth. Now, you could agree with the original coroner's report. Natalie had tried to untie the dinghy, she'd fallen into the ocean in the process because she was intoxicated and it was a slippery deck, and eventually she drowned from exhaustion and hypothermia. But the journalist was right. Natalie had this huge fear of dark water. It wasn't just a dislike, it was something she'd spoken about publicly many times. And in a movie she starred in, which ironically involved a scene which is set in the dark in open water, she begged the director to film it in a tank on the set instead. This wasn't just a dislike, it was a huge crippling phobia. And if she did try to get onto that dinghy, whatever was compelling her to do that, it must have been something greater than this huge fear that she had of drowning. You could agree with Robert Wagner because he told a very similar story to the medical examiner. He said it was the sound of the dinghy banging against the yacht which sent Natalie on deck to try and tighten the ropes, and she fell in. So they're both saying that she fell in accidentally, either because she was trying to tighten the ropes, which was Robert's idea, or because she was trying to get into the dinghy to get off the boat, and she slipped and fell. Now, the medical examiner certainly agreed with the possibility of the rope tightening theory of Robert Wagner's at the time, although years later, that very same medical examiner, in his memoir, because apparently even medical examiners need to write memoirs, he said in that memoir that the dinghy was rubber, which when striking the side of a yacht makes very little sound at all, certainly not enough sound to keep someone awake, especially when they've had a lot of alcohol. Also, he writes in that memoir, if Natalie Wood did fall overboard, accidentally she slipped and fell in the water, why did she not just swim the very short distance from where she fell to the steps which would take her back on board the yacht? Or do you believe the captain's revised statement, the later one that he made 20 years later, saying that Wood and Wagner had had the mother of all rows and he heard the dinghy being untied? Now, when you consider his theory and his revised statement, it's worth noting that at the time he was touting his story around the media, trying to sell his story of what happened that night. And he'd also written a tell-all memoir, which all of the publishers he approached very sensibly turned down, because you can just imagine the litigation that would evolve from that. So just bear that in mind when you think about Dennis Taverne's revised statement. However, the medical examiner certainly took it very seriously, because the case was actually reopened based on that in 2011. Now, Lana, who's Natalie's sister, also believes that Robert Wagner, who they all refer to as RJ, is responsible for Natalie's death. In her own memoir, she wrote, I believe RJ delivered a blow to the left side of Natalie's face that knocked her unconscious. She wrote that in her memoir and talked about the bruises and the cuts which were found on Natalie and that were recorded at the autopsy and by the LA Coroner's Office. She also said, I believe that, suddenly panic-stricken when he realised what he'd done, RJ made the fatal decision to put Natalie in the water to avoid being held responsible for what had happened. I believe that everything he did afterwards was all about covering up the drunken, jealous, rage-filled moment. Now, Taverne's second statement 20 years later certainly caused a stir, as well as resulting in the case being reopened. It led to the medical examiner changing the cause of death on Natalie's death certificate, and it was changed from drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. Even more strikingly, in 2018, Robert Wagner was declared a person of interest in the case. Furthermore, in 2020, a medical doctor who, at the time of the original accident, was an intern for the chief medical officer, said that the injuries that Natalie sustained, the bruises, grazes, and abrasions, were consistent with somebody being thrown overboard from a boat. Whatever you believe, whether you think Natalie Wood's death was just a tragic accident or whether you think something more sinister was going on, it left 2 children without a mother. Her funeral was held on December the 2nd, 1981 at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles. The mourners included Frank Sinatra, Fred Astaire, Laurence Olivier, Elizabeth Taylor, Rock Hudson, Gene Kelly, Gregory Peck and Christopher Walken. As the coffin was lowered into the grave, a musician played a simple melody on a balalaika. Like many sudden and untimely deaths of celebrities and public figures, we struggle to make sense of it. Maybe that's why there are so many theories and conspiracies around these topics and around the deaths of very well-known people. Our brains cannot compute. Our brains say there must be something more to it. Life cannot be that arbitrary, that brutal. We don't like how this story finishes, so we look for an alternative ending. But perhaps the last word should go to Christopher Walken.
The real story of her death is that she drowned, and nobody knows how she drowned or what happened except her. That's what it is. There is no real story. You know, there is. Nobody will ever know.
I hope you've enjoyed today's curious true story, one of the most talked about tales in Hollywood, and 3 brilliant books, all dealing with mysterious boats and voyages. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. It would mean an awful lot to me and to Lewis. And hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss any future episodes, because next time, join me when we will be staying in Hollywood. But this time we will be looking at a beautiful ring which appears to be cursed, and 3 books all focusing on jewellery. Join me next Sunday for that, and in the meantime, have a brilliant week.